Thank you.
So I can learn something. I could learn something.
Hopefully, listen, I've been coming for 20 years, but I haven't learned yet. All the holidays.
Okay, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So this is the second to the last class for this season. Tomorrow will be the last class. Today is Maimonides, and tomorrow will be everyday ethics. So how many of you have studied Maimonides? Yeah. Okay, so I'm not really going to talk so much about Maimonides' life because we can spend a few classes on that. But what I want to just give a brief introduction. Good morning.
Good morning.
Before you sit down, just take this with you.
Thank you.
That's the invoice. What are we going to be studying today? So, Maimonides' first body of work that he wrote was his commentary to the Talmud, known as Pirush HaMishnayot LaRambam. Later, he codified Jewish law, known as Mishnah Torah. Later, he wrote the Guide to the Perplexed, and so on. But the first thing that he began, actually in his teenage years, was his commentary to the Talmud. And in the commentary to the Talmud, there's an introduction to the entire commentary, and then there's an introduction to the tractate called The Ethics of Our Fathers. So generally, he doesn't offer such lengthy introductions throughout the commentary. But before the tractate called Pirkei Avot, The Ethics of Our Fathers, he offers a very lengthy introduction of 8 chapters. And there's an introduction to the introduction. So, and what we've been doing this year is we've been studying this introduction. So we're holding now chapter 7, 8. So I'll give you a very brief overview of what's important for today, because really, it's really a subject matter in its own. Today's subject, Maimonides touches in his codification to Jewish law as well, in his Mishnah Torah. He touches on it in his Guide to the Perplexed, but this was the first place Maimonides addressed this question. So, when we speak about ethics, we need to establish a few things. First, we need to understand ethics is a character definition. So there's physical health, body health, and then there's what he calls the soul's well-being. So there's illness of the soul and there's health of the soul, just like there's illness of the body and health in the body. And therefore, the first thing we need to understand, just like in health, in order to determine if something is well or not, you need to know the biology and the specifics of it. So you need to also know, so to speak, the map of the soul before you can address, is it healthy, unhealthy, how do you heal it, and so on. So the first thing he addresses is the map of the soul. And just one point, what's important today, is Maimonides, in this body of work, quotes a lot of other philosophers and theologians as well. So not just Jewish, but also others. Some as support, but primarily to take issue with their approach. He doesn't mention them by name. He says the reason I'm not going to mention them by name, because if I'm going to quote a truth of theirs, and people are going to hear, oh, he said that, so therefore better not mention the name and just accept the truth for what it is, if it's true. But he does quote, Plato, Aristotle, other Muslim theologians of his time, and so on. So the first thing he addresses is, Plato was of the opinion that a person possesses 3 souls. What he calls the vegetative soul, I call it the vegetative, he calls it the nutritious soul, the soul that takes care of the bodily functions. Then he has what he calls the vital soul, which I call the animalistic soul, the soul that has senses and emotions and passions, what we'll call the reactive soul. And then we have what is called, he refers to it as the psychic soul, we'll call it the human soul, which is the intellect, the mind. Second.
Oh, Josh.
Today it's too price one. When you get a chance, if you just take your phone and we have the QR codes, you can register. Just hover over the QR codes, pass it around later. Okay, so these are the three distinct souls according to Plato. Aristotle divides it into two, the rational and the super-rational. Maimonides takes issue with this approach. And Maimonides explains that according to Judaism, we have one soul. Now, we're not talking about now the divine soul, because we do have an animalistic soul and the divine soul. We're talking about the animalistic soul, the soul that does the functions of the body, from the intellectual, from the brain, all the way until, if you want to say, the feet or the digestive system. It's all one soul, the same soul that's understanding, that's studying. It's the same soul that's reacting emotionally, and it's the same soul that's processing the physical body. And Maimonides doesn't really go in specifically, what the consequence of both opinions are. But just to mention one or two, if we say that you have three distinct souls, so when you're eating, it's your vegetative soul. The reason I call it vegetative soul is because in that soul, we're equal to all vegetation. They absorb nutrition, they grow, the body absorbs food, it grows, and so on. So the vegetative soul does, in that we're equivalent to a vegetable. The animal soul, which is the emotional soul, according to Plato, is the animal within. We're equal to an animal in that. And then the psychic soul, that's uniquely human. Right? So we have sort of each category of creation we possess within ourselves. The problem with saying that is, then it comes out that in our growth, food, sleep, anything that we need for the physical body to exist and mature, we're really no different than a tree or a plant. And it's not expected of us. Sorry.
Here, take this.
We'll have to share. We're really the same. When it comes to emotions, reactions, passions, that's the animalistic soul. That's what he calls the vital soul. In that, we're no different than animals. When it comes to intellectual engagement, then we employ the human soul, the psychic soul, and that's where we're uniquely human. And the problem with saying that is, they say in anecdotes that Aristotle was considered, and even by Maimonides, as the epitome of the human mind. And he was the teacher, not just of philosophy, but of ethics and so on. And they once caught Aristotle in an immoral act. So his students say Aristotle. For some of them know Yiddish, they would say "feh," right? It's unbecoming. So to which he responded, "This is not Aristotle." Which you might think is a cop-out answer, right? What do you mean? You're Aristotle, how are you doing it? But if you take that as three distinct souls and different souls are governing different functions, then when he was engaging in bodily pleasures, that was the vegetative soul. Maybe you might say it was passion, so it was the animalistic soul. But the soul in the study hall, in academia, that's the psychic soul. That's Aristotle. So it's different souls, different people. But if you take Maimonides' view, which is that it's one and the same soul doing all the functions, then you're the same human being with different faculties. So the same human being, the same person, the same soul that's studying and comes to the ethical or philosophical conclusions is the exact same soul which is reacting emotionally, and the exact same soul which is eating and sleeping. So you have no excuse to say, well, that's not me. So it has bearing on in a very practical way. It's also the way we expect a human being to eat or sleep or engage in other physical things. If it's the vegetative soul, then we can be a vegetable in that way. We have no accountability, no responsibility. We don't have to be human. We don't have to be rational in those activities, the same as in the emotional part of our life. We're justified when we get angry. I mean, what do you get me angry? I just responded. It's not my fault. What should I do? I mean, I'm like an animal. But if you're human, and it's the same human that's rational and the same human that's emotional, the same human that's functioning, then you can't just be human when you're studying. You have to be human in the way you eat. You have to be human in the way you sleep. You have to be human in the way you engage. You have to be human in the way you vacation. You have to be human in the way you react. It's one and the same human being. So that's the first point Maimonides makes. Once he lays that out, then he gets into the illness of the soul, the health of the soul. I'm not going to run through every detail now. I just want to jump a little bit, and he goes then to the balanced approach. So Maimonides was a very strong advocate for two things. One is a holistic approach to health. So even when we talk about physical health, because it's one soul doing the bodily functions as well as the psychic functions, so it's the same soul. So that means the physical health affects your psychological health, and your psychological health affects your physical health. So this is going back today, it's more acceptable, but this is going 1,000 years back. It wasn't so conventional, yet Maimonides is a very strong proponent of this approach. And the second is that what is considered a healthy approach psychologically and cognitively, so Maimonides takes the approach of balance. He very strongly negates extremism in either way or form as something being unhealthy. Now, some people might think, well, extreme in one way, okay, I understand that's like very wrong, but the extreme of the opposite would be very good. And Maimonides points out that no, extreme is not healthy. For example, I'll use one example for today. For example, bravery. Bravery is looked at in society as heroic. Right now, I'm not talking about bravery as saving somebody else's life. That's a different discussion. Doing something in your own life, climbing Mount Everest. Is that brave? I mean, I wouldn't do it, so it's probably brave. Is it heroic? Well, we put these people that mastered it on a pedestal, right? We recognize them. History recognizes them. They have, what would be the opposite of that? Cowardness, right? So you would say cowardness there's nothing positive to that, right? Just a coward. But bravery, that's like, something to celebrate. So Maimonides points out, actually, bravery is just being irresponsible. That's what it is. You're putting yourself in death's pathway, and by chance or by miracle, you survived. That's not positive. That's not healthy. That's irresponsible. So what is healthy? Maybe the other extreme. No, cowardice is also not healthy. Apathy is also not healthy. So it's the balance. The balance, he wrote it in Arabic, so what we have today is a translation we'll call courage. Courage is a balance. You have the courage, so you're not apathetic, you're not cowardly, but you're also not going to do something irresponsible. It's the middle ground. And in every single one, generous. Is generous considered good or bad? Well, if somebody says only yes and doesn't know how to say no, is that good or bad? I mean, for us rabbis, fundraising, it's good, of course. but it's unhealthy, right? So what's the opposite? Stingy. Is that good or bad? No. So again, you need the balance. Well, people don't recognize that. When you see somebody so generous giving, you think of them as, wow, it's so good. But really, it's an unhealthy psychological state of being. It's coming from somewhere unhealthy. And the same is the opposite. If someone is apathetic, sometimes we can translate it, well, they're content. Are they content or are they lazy? Right? So again, so you have to find always the balance, and not always what feels right and feels spiritual or feels ethical or healthy is. It could be unhealthy. And then he goes in, again, I don't have time to get into all the details. For that, you'll have to go back to the classes online for all the past 7 weeks. But how do you get to the balance? If you're, deviating to either side, how do you get back to the balance? Once he establishes all of that, again, one soul, and therefore you're responsible for every one of your acts from the mental all the way down to the functional. The balance is the proper path. Then he moves on to the next point, which is a very important point. And that is that it's not enough to have a balanced lifestyle, again, physically and emotionally, but you have to have a purpose for why you're living. If you have a balanced lifestyle, and that's where it starts and ends, then what's the purpose? So there has to be an objective to life. So life has to be balanced, but there has to be objective. Why am I living? And really, you measure, are you proper? Are you balanced based on that objective? So really, is it feeding my objective? Is it supporting my objective of life or not? And that's how you determine, is it proper or improper? What is that objective? So from purely a religious perspective, the objective, of course, is God's, to connect to God, to serve God. But really, if you think about it from a philosophical perspective, it's the same idea. There has to be something larger than life, something larger than consciousness, which is, again, human life or creation. There has to be something larger than creation. That's the purpose. You can't say that the purpose of life is to live. Let me give you an example for that, so maybe you can relate to what I'm saying. Would somebody argue that the purpose of life is food? We all need food. We all enjoy food. We all spend money on food. But is the purpose of life just to eat? There are people that spend their whole day and their whole night only about food. They think about food. They talk about food. They engage in food. They watch TV shows about food. They watch only food, day in, day out. That's all they talk about. Imagine such a person. What do you think about it? Or her? Or it, whatever.
Out of balance.
You think in Yiddish, you say nebuch. You know what nebuch means? It's sad. It's sad that that's the only thing they have in life. Right? So is it important? Yes. Is it important to have proper food and good food and even tasty food? Yes. But that's a supportive part of our life. That's not the objective of life. Right? So if eating is not the objective, and could we all agree on that at least, right? It's not. So why not? If life is just about living, live and be merry because tomorrow you're going to die, right? So then what's wrong? Why do we look at such a person that has nothing more than food in their life as nebuch? Because we all understand, whether we're aware of it or not, that life's purpose is not just to live. And if life's purpose is not just to live, then life's purpose can't just be to support living. Because to support living is, again, it's just to live. So therefore, it's not just about me supporting my own life, but if I'm going to support your life, but it's only about you living and me living, then what's the purpose of that? So there has to be something larger than life, something more meaningful, something what we call supernatural, something greater, something transcendent, that then life is trying to achieve that. And so that's the next part that Maimonides speaks about, that we always have to measure, is this helping me serve my purpose in life or not? If it's helping me serve my purpose in life, then it's something positive. If not, then it's something negative. So take, for example, abstinence. Is abstinence a spiritual experience or not? And I don't mean just with regard to intimacy. I'm talking about in general. We use it today only in one area. That's the only thing we think about. But it's really about food. It could be any physical pleasure, really. So abstinence is depriving yourself of that. There are theologies. You say, no, that's true. But there are theologies, and not just outside of Judaism, within Judaism as well. And there are people that feel that when you deprive yourself, I'm so spiritual and holy.
Our purpose in life, according to Elohim, is that we should be continuing to create the world, to make the world a better place.
So again, very good. So in other words, that's exactly the point. So what Maimonides says is, if you measure your balance against the backdrop of your objective, which is to serve God, you always have to ask yourself, if what I'm doing is serving God, not if it makes me feel good or bad, is it serving God? Is it serving that purpose or not? So I can eat, and I can eat enjoyable food, and that can be a spiritual experience if it helps me serve God. So if I'm going to eat food, I'm going to feel good about myself. If I eat food, I'm going to be healthy. So then I'll be able to think straight. I'll be able to function properly. I'll be able to be more sensitive and patient, and therefore I'll be able to serve my purpose. Then the food is actually a positive and a spiritual experience. But if I abstain and I'm hungry, and therefore I'm irritable, and therefore I can't think straight, then that's actually an anti-spiritual experience because it's actually a detriment to serving God. So it's not about how it makes you feel. It's again, is it helping me in my purpose? Is it magnifying my ability to do that purpose or not? So once he does all this that we spoke about and much more, now we come to, I'm jumping over chapter 7. I'm coming now to chapter 8. We're going to do the last chapter in this introduction. What does Maimonides deal with in this chapter? So first and foremost, he deals with choice, free choice, accountability, because that's the most important thing when we talk about ethics. Are you accountable for your actions, right? And now, if we talk about legalities, you might, okay, legalities is a behavioral thing. Do this, don't do that, stop at the red light, don't stop at the red light, right? But we talk about ethics, it's more of a character persona sort of thing. What kind of person are you? How generous, how compassionate, and so on. And here you might make the argument, well, it's not my fault. I was born this way. I was conditioned this way, and so on. And so in chapter 8, he deals with the idea that every person has freedom of choice. We have certain tendencies that make it maybe easier or more difficult, but ultimately we have the choice of what kind of person we want to be, a virtuous or the opposite. Okay, so that's point number 1 that he makes very strong, which we'll see inside soon. Then he makes another 3 points. One is that what is the counter argument to free choice? What? No choice. Okay, which is the theory of determinism. Okay, which again, there's theologies, philosophies, but generally astrology is a supporter of that opinion, which is that everything can be seen in astrology and based, you're born at a certain time and a certain thing, and pretty much that's the kind of person you are, and they can sort of claim to predict your destiny, right? So Maimonides takes very strong issue with that. By the way, in last week's Torah portion that we actually read about that as well. Because the Torah takes issue with it. There's no such a thing that things are predetermined. We have absolute free choice. Does that mean that there's no truth to astrology? No, there is, which is that you're going to have certain tendencies. But ultimately, you create your own destiny. And therefore, you're responsible, therefore, you're accountable. And therefore, it's not just negative, which is you're accountable, you're responsible, you're guilty for what you've done. It's actually the most empowering thing if you think about it. That you can always, at any point in your life, even if you failed until now, you can decide, I'm going to change. I'm going to become better. I'm going to learn from my mistakes. So not only aren't you born predestined, but at any point in your life, you're not stuck. You're not doomed. Because you always maintain the ability of free choice. Having said that, Maimonides then goes to the seemingly scriptural counter argument to free choice. Now, you think, what's the counter argument? If free choice is the foundation of religion. If not for free choice, then why are we commanded to do certain things and prohibited? I mean, what do you mean? I'm not doing it, it's being done. So what do you want from me, right? And why are we given reward and punishment and so on? What's the concept? There's no justice to the consequence. I'm told don't do this, and if you're going to do it, you're going to be punished. But I had no choice. It was predetermined that I'm going to do it. And why are you upset at me? It was predetermined that you're going to get, injured by me. So why is the whole justice system is really a farce? It's just a facade. It's not real. But there is a counter argument, which is we find in Scripture that things were predetermined. Seemingly, where were things predetermined? Anybody? No, the flood was a consequence afterwards. He gave them 120 years to repent. Nobody? You say this in the Haggadah. Passover at the Seder. Maybe we should start saying the Haggadah in English. The first vision that Abraham had, God made a covenant with Abraham called the Brit Ben Hapsarim. In that covenant, God told him that in 400 years, your seed, your children, remember he didn't have any children yet, are going to be enslaved in Egypt. And the Egyptians are going to enslave them, going to torture them, and then eventually I'll punish the Egyptians. Okay? So in other words, it was predetermined that the Egyptians are going to enslave the Israelites. Could they have done otherwise? Then God would make a mistake, right? So it's predetermined. If it's predetermined, why are you punishing the Egyptians? God said that the Egyptians are going to enslave them. 400 years later, they're just playing out God's plan. So isn't that predetermination? So that's issue number one. And Maimonides addresses this issue. I'm going to explain it. We'll get to it in a second. After he explains this issue, he still has a second issue. Within this category, there's a subcategory with Pharaoh himself, which we'll see once we understand the answer. We'll see why it's still a question of Pharaoh. And he answers that question as well. And then he comes to the third question, which is the fourth part in this chapter, which is how do you reconcile God knowing everything, precognition, meaning he knows before we do anything, with free choice. So there's two parts. One is that God, so to speak, said to Abraham that this is what's going to happen. So there was a clear prophecy about it. So how could anything else happen? But even if we explain how it's not a contradiction, that's not a predetermination, but ultimately the question is if God knows everything before it happens, then how do you have free choice? So these are the questions. Let's go through one by one, and we're going to explain what the question is, what the answer is. So let's go through the source sheet as far as we can get. I'm not going to run through every single thing because, as Marty said, we're not going to finish. But let's just see some of the points, and then we'll explain it outside. So number one on the sheet, chapter 8. It is impossible for a man to be born endowed by nature from his very birth with either virtue or vice. Just as it is impossible that he should be born skilled by nature in any particular art. It is possible, however, that through natural causes he may from birth be so constituted as to be equipped for a particular virtue or vice, so that he will more easily practice it than any other. Okay, so just like he gives several examples, but the idea is he uses the idea of a skill. In Yiddish, you say, a scholar is not somebody that has a high IQ. A scholar is somebody that actually studies. Right? You can have a high IQ, but if you don't study, it's worthless, right? So you're not born with knowledge. You have to actually develop. But if you have a high IQ, you have what to develop. You have, makes it easier and quicker and so on. Someone that doesn't have a high IQ will make it harder for him, but he can still gain knowledge based on his capabilities. He doesn't have an excuse that I'm incapable. And the same as in every example. So we're born with tendencies, but ultimately we're not born with a predetermination of what we're going to be. Nobody is born a scholar, nobody is born virtuous, and so on.
A doctor or a gambler?
Oh, that we are born. My son is a nun. I have entered into the subject so thou mayest not believe the absurd ideas of astrologers who falsely assert that the constellation at the time of one's birth determines whether one is to be virtuous or vicious. The individual being thus necessarily compelled to follow out a certain line of conduct. We, on the contrary, are convinced that our Torah agrees that man's conduct is entirely in his own hands, that no compulsion is exerted and no external influence is brought to bear upon him that constrains him to be either virtuous or vicious, except inasmuch as, according to what we have said above, he may be by nature so constituted as to find it easy or hard, as the case may be, to do a certain thing, but that he must necessarily do or refrain from doing a certain thing is absolutely untrue. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the ideas, I think pretty clear. And Maimonides explains that this is the foundation of religion, that this is the foundation of the justice system. Whether religious or secular, it's irrelevant, but it's the whole idea. Otherwise, it's injustice. I mean, if the example he uses, if Reuben goes ahead and kills Shimon, so according to Judaism, if there's witnesses, etc., so there's the capital punishment. But if Reuben was predetermined that he was going to kill Shimon, and Shimon was predetermined that he's going to be killed by Reuben, then where's the justice? Why are you killing Reuben? It's not him; he's just a puppet. being is the we used to say the joystick. I don't know what today's modern game equipment is, but God is playing the joystick, right? In other words, it's just God doing it. It's not Reuben doing it. Why you meting justice to Reuben? So that's really an injustice. And then Maimonides in number 6, I'll just say this outside, says that the Talmud tells us all is in the hands of heaven besides the fear of heaven. So part of it seems to support what we're saying. The fear of heaven, meaning choices that we make with regard to good and bad, is not in the hand of heaven. That's in our hands. But what is everything else that is in the hand of heaven? So Maimonides makes a distinction. We have choice in areas of good and bad, but there are certain areas in our life that we really don't have choice. For example, you can plow a field, so you have choice whether you're going to plow the field or not. But whether it's going to rain or not, whether it's going to be successful or not, is beyond your choice. So there is, of course, areas that God is in absolute control, but that's not your destiny as far as what kind of person you're going to be. So what kind of person you're going to be, that's dependent on you. But whether you're going to make money in life or whether you're going to be healthy, irrelevant of your choices, meaning sometimes things happen that are that's not by your choice. That doesn't depend on you. So those things are determined by God. So that's in the hand of heaven. So now we move on to number 8. It now remains for us to explain another phase of this problem, which arises from the fact that there are several scriptural passages in which some think they found proof that God preordains and forces man to disobedience. One of these is that in which God said to Abraham, and they, meaning the Egyptians, will enslave them, meaning the Israelites, and they will afflict them. Is it not evident, it is claimed, that God decreed that the Egyptians should oppress the seed of Abraham? Then why did he punish them? Since owing to divine predestination, it was unavoidably decreed that they should enslave the Israelites. So how do you reconcile these scriptural sources with saying that we have free choice? The answer to this is as follows. Suppose God has said that of those who are to be born in the future, some were to be transgressors and others observers of the Torah, some pious and some wicked. Such would take place, but it would by no means follow from this divine decree that a certain individual would necessarily have to do evil, or that another pious individual would be forced to do good. On the contrary, the evildoer would become such of his own will, his own free will. If he preferred to be a righteous person, it would be in his power, and nothing could prevent him from becoming such. Likewise, if every righteous man preferred to do evil, nothing would hinder him, for God's decree was not pronounced against any certain individual, so that he might say, it has already been decreed that I do this or that, but these words applied to the general community, at the same time allowing every individual to retain his own free will according to the very makeup of his nature. Consequently, every Egyptian who maltreated or oppressed the Israelites had it in his own power not to do them any injury unless he wanted to, for it was not ordained that any certain individual should harm them. So this is the first argument Maimonides makes, and he makes this argument in his codification to Jewish law as well, which is a very simple distinction, which is God ordained that the Egyptians are going to enslave the Israelites, but which, he didn't say every single one of them, the nation as a whole will enslave the Israelites, but each individual Egyptian, when enslaving the people under him, that was by free choice, okay? Now, this is all good when we talk about this statement to Abraham and the Egyptians. That nation is going to enslave your seed. But then we have an individual case, an individual where God seemingly preordains what they're going to be doing. So this is number 10. As regards, however, to the words of God in Exodus, and I will harden the heart of Pharaoh, afterwards punishing him with death, there is much to be said. Because here you can't say it's the nation anymore. Here was a specific person, the king of Egypt, that God tells Moses, you're going to ask him to let the people go. I'm going to harden his heart. He will not let you go throughout all the 9 plagues until I bring the final plague of the newborn. And only then will he let you go. And yet you're punishing them with all the 9 plagues, and then you're punishing them with the death of the firstborn. Not his fault. He wanted to let them go, but God said, I'm going to harden his heart. So how do you reconcile this example with free choice? So Maimonides has a novel answer to this question. He says there are other answers, and you can choose whichever answer you want, and maybe they're all true. But Maimonides' approach is the following. I'll say it outside because I really want to move on to the next subject a little bit as well. What Maimonides says is that God hardening the heart of Pharaoh was actually part of the punishment. It wasn't predetermining a choice that he'll make and then punish him. That was actually part of the punishment. Why? Because how old was Moses when he was sent to Pharaoh to tell him, let my people go?
80.
He was 80 years old. Moses was already born in Egypt, right? Everybody knows the story. He was born in Egypt. Which means by the time Moses came to Pharaoh, if you look through scripture, you'll find that the Jews were already in Egypt for 209 years. Okay? And of that period of time, about 117 of those years, they were enslaved. So you go back to the beginning of Exodus, where it talks about they're multiplying and they're going to overtake it, and therefore we have to kill their children, and so and they afflicted them. So all that happened years before, 117 years before it started happening. Moses came and said, "Let my people go." So that means for 117, 116 of those years, they made their own choice to enslave and to afflict the Israelites. So now 116 years doing that, as part of the punishment, God sends Moses to Pharaoh, says, let my people go, but I will take away your free choice during this 10, 12-month period. Taking away his free choice was part of the punishment. Why? Because God wanted to punish him for the 116 years. He didn't want him to have the opportunity to repent. Because he wanted to make sure he's going to get punished. So therefore, he took away his free choice to make sure that he's punished for the choices that he made. Maimonides uses an example to understand this concept. We don't understand God's ways, punishment, we don't understand. But we know that there are many different ways God can punish people, right? So let's say an example of one way where, as a punishment, again, we're not getting into the theology of it now, the philosophy of it. But let's say as a punishment, God decrees that somebody has to lose their arm. Okay? Because they lose their arm, they can't put on tefillin now. They don't have an arm. So that's it. It was predetermined that losing the arm was the result of your free choice. That was the punishment. So yes, there's a consequence to the punishment that now you might lose certain abilities and certain flexibilities and certain choices that you now can't make. But that you lost your choice is really the result of your own free choice. So the same applies with Pharaoh. God tells Pharaoh, I'm going to take away your free choice. And I'm going to let you know that even though everything is telling you let them go, your own people are telling you let them go, your own advisors are telling you won't be able to. It will be clear that there's a blockage, and you'll know that it was because of me. And this is in the text also throughout. You see in Exodus, where when Moses goes to tell Pharaoh, he tells him, I know you're not going to let my people go. And why am I telling it to you? So that everybody should recognize that when God wills, then you lose your choice. So that, therefore, my mind is in such a case where an individual loses his choice, it's not predetermined. It's a result of his own determination. It's the punishment, not part of the pre-punishment. After he explains that, then he goes to the real question. And the real question is, if God, again, as we mentioned earlier, if God knows everything, if God knows everything that's going to happen before it happens, right? The omnipotent God, the all-knowing God, then if God knows everything that's going to happen, then really you have no choice, right? Think of it like this. If God knows what's going to happen, but I have a choice, If I choose different than what God knew, that means he made a mistake. Right? Could God make a mistake? If he doesn't make a mistake, then it has to be exactly the way he knew. So where's free choice? And this is a very deep question. Now, what's interesting is, in his codification of Jewish law, Maimonides brings up the same question. And when you read it superficially, he seems not to offer an answer. He says it's a very long answer, and it cannot be recorded in writing. But you have to know the truth, that they're both true. God knows everything before it's going to happen. He's the all-knowledgeable God, and at the same time, we have free choice. How they reconcile, okay, whatever, but you have to know the truth. There was a rabbinic critic of Maimonides, referred to as the Ravid, Rabbi Avram ben David, who lived. Maimonides was, the leader of Spanish Sephardic Jewry. He was in France. He was part of the Ashkenazic. And he took issue with Maimonides for several reasons. But when Maimonides came out with his codification, the Jewish law, his Mishnah Torah, so he wrote critique on it. The reason that he wrote critique, because he took issue with Maimonides, that Maimonides only wrote the law and he didn't write the rationale of the law. And really, you can't apply law without understanding the intent of the law. So that was his main issue that he had with Maimonides. And therefore, he critiqued his body of work, which we have those notes. And in almost every printed Hebrew version of Maimonides, we have his notes on it as well, which is also fascinating, because that means wherever he didn't critique, he agrees with Maimonides. So it actually offers a very interesting insight. But when it comes to this question, the Ravid says about Maimonides, he didn't act as a wise person. Why not? Because you bring up a question, a very deep theological question, and you don't offer a solution. So if a person already had the question before he read Maimonides, you didn't contribute anything because you left it with a question. If a person didn't have a question, you introduced doubt and you didn't offer a solution. So what did you do? Where's the wisdom? And he himself offers a very simple solution to the question. The question that he offers, the answer that he offers is, he says simple. God knows as a result of what we do. Just like we know. If I see you do something, I know that you did it. God knows as a result that you do. But since God is not bound by time, so therefore technically he knows before, because there is no before. So there's no before, present, and future. By God, everything is present. It's hard to wrap our mind around such a reality. But at least conceptually we can understand this, that God is beyond time. So therefore he knows as a result that we do, but in the framework of time, he always knows, even technically before. So it's before in time, but not before in cause and effect, which is a very simple answer, right? Simple. He knows as a result, so we have choice. Because of our choices, that's how he knows. It's just not bound by time. What? And then it's interesting. The Ravid finishes off this answer, and he says, really, it's not such a good answer. He doesn't say why, but at least it's some answer to satisfy the question. Why doesn't Maimonides accept this answer? It seems to be such a straightforward answer. So actually, if you want to, we spoke about this at length last year when we spoke about the 13 principles of faith. If you want, you can go back to last year's classes online, week 6, 7, and 8, 3 weeks. It took us to go through this. But I'm just going to say the pointers. I'm not going to keep you here for too long. And this, I think, in this body of work, in the introduction to the Ethics of Our Fathers, you see that Maimonides uses this as actually seemingly the direction of the answer. There are three major theological issues with the Ravid's answer. Anybody want to guess what they are? Nobody? Okay. So Remember, what is the premise of the Ravid's answer? That God knows as a result of what we do. As a result of what we do, just he's not bound by time, but it's really as a result of what we do. The first theological question is, God doesn't change. Right? God doesn't change. Change implies, we'll talk this, all three theological issues are really interconnected, but we'll divide them into three. First of all, the verse clearly says this, that I am God, I haven't changed, and I don't change. But really, even philosophically, we understand that change implies what? You're different today than you were yesterday. God doesn't change. Something absolute doesn't change. It doesn't age, it doesn't develop, it doesn't grow, it doesn't transform. It is. Okay, just let me in a nutshell, literally in a nutshell, because we don't have time. All of reality can be divided into two categories: absolute and non-absolute. What is an example of non-absolute? It's usually called in philosophical terms efshariya mitziyut, meaning a possible existence. It doesn't have to be, it's a possible. It's not absolute. What's an example of non-absolute? Everything you know about is non-absolute. Everything you see, the chairs, the tables, the house, even ourselves, we're not absolute. There was a time we weren't. There'll be a time that we're not. We're not absolute. What is an example of absolute? Well, okay, but before we get to God, I'm trying to apply that to God. So even an intellectual idea, intellectual truth, 2 + 2 is 4. Yeah? Is it 4? I think so, right? That's absolute. It is because it is, right? So what's the difference between something that's absolute versus something that's not absolute? The difference is the assumption. Now, what do I mean the assumption? When you see something that's absolute, when you see it, when you experience it, you don't ask why. It's self-evident why. 2 + 2 is 4. You don't. It should be like that. The assumption is that that's the way it should be. If you do a mathematical equation and it ends up not being 4, then all of a sudden, what happened? Something went wrong, right? So when it is, that's the assumption it should be. When it's seemingly not, that's when you have a question why and how. A non-absolute existence is the other way around. When you walk into a room and you see no furniture, you walk into a field and you see no houses. You know, what? What do you mean, why? Why should it be? The assumption is that it's a it doesn't exist. When you see it, then you have a question, how did it come about? Why did it come about? And so on. So the assumption is non-existent, and the non-assumption is existence. Okay, so it's the polar opposites. So therefore, something that's absolute, if the assumption is that it is, it always has to be. You don't ask 2 + 2. When did it start? When did 2 + 2 start being 4? When is it going to already age? Just stop already. Come on. You know, I wanted to count my money, and I wanted to count 1 and 2 and 3 and get to 1 trillion overnight. I mean, it doesn't work like that. It's always. It always was, it always is, and it always will be. Okay? How about space? Is it true only here and not somewhere else? No, because if it's true here and not somebody else, that's not absolute. It doesn't have to be. So something absolute is true always, everywhere. Something that's not absolute is defined. It's defined to the time that it is, to the space that it is, and so on. So if God is absolute, God is the only absolute. Even 2 + 2 is 4 is because God decided it to be that way. But the only absolute is really God. God has to be. Everything else doesn't have to be. If God has to be, absolute has to be always, everywhere. It can't change. Change means that the way I am now is not the way I was a moment ago. So that means it didn't have to be. The proof to it is that a moment ago I wasn't that way. If a moment ago I wasn't that way, then I didn't have to be that way. And if the way I'm now is different than the way I was before, so now what I'm now doesn't have to be. So therefore, change doesn't apply to an absolute. It doesn't mean that God is static, sort of frozen in time. But whatever happens is not a change. It's not becoming new, different growth, and so on. So therefore, the first theological problem with saying that God knows what we do as a result of what we do is change. Why is that change? Because think about it. He didn't have this information before. We did something, we chose something, we acted in a certain way, and all of a sudden he acquired a new piece of information. What happens when you acquire a new piece of information? You change. It's experience. You grow, right? It affects you and so on. So that means God is constantly changing. All this information, all this experience, all these people, all these choices, and so on, is all having an effect on God. That's change. So you can't say God knows as a result of what we do, because then it would imply change in God. That's number one. Number two is that it implies that there is plurality in God. See, one of the fundamentals of Judaism is the belief in a monotheistic God, right? The one God. But it's not just that there's one God and no other gods. Monotheistic God means that this God is one, not made up of different parts. It's not a composite of different parts. Why not? So I'll say it one way, and that is what differentiates one part from a different part?
Boundary.
Boundary means limitation. The limit, this is what this is, it stops here, and this is what this is, and it starts here. They're each one individually limited. So when you have a composite of parts, what do you have? A bunch of limitations coming together. A bunch of limitations coming together don't create infinity. All it does is it expounds and extends the finite. It adds more finite, but it doesn't transition. You never go from finite to infinite. Now, I know in math we use the term infinite numbers, but really it's not the true definition of infinity. Because again, if each number is limited, all you added is another number, another finite, and another. You stretch the finite. You haven't transitioned to infinity. Infinity is a different quality. It's not just a different quantity. So therefore, if we accept that God is infinite, has no limitations, no definition, then it cannot be made up of individual limitations. It cannot be a composite of parts. So it's a oneness beyond what we understand as one, because every oneness that we think is a composite of parts. A body is made up of different limbs. Even if you think of a simple organism, which you'll argue is one not made up of parts. So first of all, it's one that doesn't have different parts. But even if we'll say that it's one, it does have different parts. The right side of it is different than the left side of it. So it does have different parts. This is the different angle, the different parts. You can split it. You can cut it. So ultimately, it is really different parts. Whether they were different parts to begin with and then came together, or whether they were initially one, but it's made up of different parts. So therefore, if we speak about an infinite God, you cannot speak about a God that's made up of many finites. You can't speak of a pluralistic God. It has to be a one unified God. And therefore, we can't say that God knows as a result of what we do. Why? Because think of it, if God didn't know before, now he's acquiring new pieces of information, and that influences God. So that means he's made up, in addition to all these individual limited pieces of information. That's pluralism. So again, you can't say plurality with regard to God. You can't say that he knows as a result of what we do. Number three, which is again intertwined with what we said earlier, that it implies that God is limited, not only because of a composite of parts, but implies that God is limited because think of it this way. Did he have this piece of information before? No. He knows as a result of what we're doing, right? So if he didn't have the piece of, he was missing this piece of information. Now you add it. Could you add to infinity? You can only add to something that's finite. So got to here, and now I'm going to add a little bit more. If God is infinite, there's nothing more to add. If you're telling me there is more to add, then that means that he was finite to begin with. So because of these three, and maybe more reasons, change, plurality, and And limitation is why we can't say that God knows as a result of what we do. So how does he know? So the answer is because God doesn't know as a result of reality. On the contrary, reality is the result of God's knowledge. He knows from within himself because he is the creator of reality. So therefore, he knows by knowing himself. He doesn't have to go out to figure out what's happening. He knows everything from within himself. But then that creates a problem. If reality is the result of his knowledge, then where's free choice? That's why Maimonides didn't want to take the answer of the Ravid, which is that God knows as a result. But because of that, that creates a deep theological issue. So in a nutshell, what Maimonides does answer is, and this is important to understand, it sounds initially like, seemingly like a leap of faith or a cop-out answer, you might say, but really, if you think about it, it's a very deep answer. And that is that on one hand, you have to say God knows, right? If you can say he doesn't know, then you're limiting God. At the same time, you have to say, how does God know? If it's not just that God cannot know as a result of what we're doing, because that creates plurality. If we're by human being, there are three parts to the human being. There's the person, there's his faculty of knowledge, his brain, and then there's the information that he acquires. There's three distinct things. How do you know three distinct things? First of all, the third thing is obvious, because even if you don't acquire information, you're still human. You're still who you are, right? But how about your faculty of your cognitive faculty? That's also not who you are, right? Because if that's who you are, the moment we begin to experience dementia, then we should become less human. Obviously, we're not less human, right? So our humanity is not determined by our faculties. So if the humanity is not determined by our faculties, that means the faculty is distinct from our humanity. We have a faculty of knowledge. So we have three things. There's the person, there's the faculty, and then there's the information. And they come together every time we try to acquire new information. If we were to say the same with God, there's this faculty of knowledge, and then there's the information, that would imply plurality. That would imply limitation. Again, distinct parts. So therefore, on one hand, you have to say God knows. But God's knowledge is part of his oneness. God is his knowledge is God. It's one and the same. Therefore, just like we can't understand God, because God is not just infinite, but even infinite is not a good word for God. You know why? Because even infinite is also a definition. It's the exclusion of the reality of the finite. You can't say anything about God, not finite, near infinite. It's beyond anything that we can say about God. So even when we speak about, if we can't understand God, then we can't understand the knowledge of God, because the knowledge of God, again, is not super glued to God, but it's actually part of God himself. So therefore, says Maimonides, the problem that we have, the contradiction, the paradox between all-knowing and free choice is because we use the human model of knowledge. And if I knew before what you're going to do, then obviously the only way is that you have to do what I knew. Otherwise, I didn't know, or otherwise you don't have free choice, right? So how do you... God's knowledge, just so we can understand God, we can't understand what it means God knows. Therefore, God's knowledge could be such that he knows, and yet at the same time, it doesn't influence our free choice. Now, how do you do that? So that Maimonides says that takes a long time to explain, but at least we can understand it's not a cop-out answer. It's really explaining that it's a different kind, a different way God knows. You know, as the verse says in Psalms, you know, that if the creator of the eye for sure sees, the creator of the ear for sure hears, right? But everybody understands that God doesn't see using an eye. And God doesn't hear using an ear. So he sees everything. How does he see? Is it a cop-out to say, I don't know? It's not a cop-out to say, I don't know. So you can be absolute that he sees everything, and it's absolute that he hears everything, and at the same time, it's not a cop-out, but it's humility to say that I don't understand, I can't wrap my mind around something greater than myself. Although I know the result is that he sees, but how he sees, I don't know. The only way I know to see is through a physical eye or through a mechanic eye. But God has neither. The only way to hear is through a physical ear or through a mechanic ear, but God has neither. But at the same time, he knows. So the same thing with knowledge. How does God know? We don't understand what knowledge by God means because it's part of who he is. But the fact that the result that he knows is absolute. And the fact that we have free choice is also absolute. And therefore, that's what you have to come at the end. We have to remain with these two truths, is that you have to know that God knows and God is watching, and at the same time, that we have absolute responsibility and accountability with regard to what we do. I just want to finish with one practical application of what Maimonides here is saying. And that is talking about the first point that we made, that God doesn't change. So we said two things. God doesn't change. And we also said that every part of God is part of God. In other words, it's not a composite connected to God, but it's actually one of the same God that's absolute, the same God that's beyond infinite. Everything you're going to say about God is part of that absoluteness and part of that infinity. So therefore, when we speak about God not changing, that doesn't only apply to God not changing, but that applies to everything you're going to say about God. God's knowledge doesn't change. God's willpower doesn't change. God's desires doesn't change. All of that, because again, if it changes, that means that it is God, so God is changing. Therefore, this is a very important fact when we talk about religion. So there is the approach that religion, the mitzvot applied 3,500 years ago when the Jews were in the desert, but now we live a whole new reality. There's modernity. If Sinai would have happened today, we would have been given a whole different set of rules. Things change. It doesn't apply anymore. Well, that means that God changes. If God's will changes, that means God changes. If we accept that God knows not as a result of reality, but reality is actually a result of God's knowing, then the same applies to the mitzvot. God's will doesn't change, because that would imply God himself changes. Again, it's one and the same. And that implies that it's not that God wanted as a result of reality. Okay, let me see what the world is. Okay, now I'll tell him do these mitzvot. On the contrary, God first willed and then created reality to match up to that will. So if God doesn't change, and if God is absolute, and if God doesn't make mistakes, and God is eternal, then his will, his mitzvot also don't change, and they also are eternal, and they also apply today in the 21st century as well, just as much as they applied 3,500 years ago. I'll stop over here. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you didn't register yet, so you can take your phone and just, we have the QR code and hover over it and just register.
In philosophical terms.
Just we send out the notice of our events, and then holiday guides and such things.
In philosophical